My name's Greg Shafrai. We're going to talk a little bit about some location-based games and the idea of designing a casual location-based game today. So I work for a company called Gigantic Mechanic that I started with my partner Mattia Romeo. We also run a festival called the Come Out and Play Festival. It's a festival each year that involves a lot of real-world games around New York City. Everything from big outdoor scavenger hunts to capture the flag, and I'll show you some pictures of some of those games, and we'll talk a little about some of them in a little bit. I also just finished writing a book called Casual Game Design, Designing Play for the Gamer and All of Us. And this book is, it really takes a look at casual games in a bunch of different formats, everything from things like Bejeweled to Jenga, and what makes for casual play, like what are the sort of principles of casual game design. So I'm really interested in the iPhone right now, and Gigantic Mechanic, our company is focused on making games for the iPhone, just because it's an interesting platform that allows for this sort of to allow you to make new and interesting games, ones that have that use location and have a really large ways to interact with the world, through data and that sort of thing. And also, it's the sort of thing that a lot of people can take with them anywhere they go. People have been wanting to make games like this for a long time, but in the U.S. anyway, you really didn't have an install base that was really big enough to support interesting location-based games. But now with the iPhone, I think you're getting to that point. So here's Bejeweled. Everyone's, I'm sure, played this at some point. I'm going to talk a little bit about casual games today and kind of outline some general thoughts on what makes for casual gameplay. And here's a map of New York City. And so this is what we wanted to do with Gigaput was do a game that kind of combines some of the really casualness of a game like Bejeweled with the location elements of a real-world game. We think games that take place in the real world are really interesting, and they tie you to place and offer an entirely different way to look at play and gaming. And the sort of combination of those two things wound up with Gigaput. So here's a screen from that. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to play it yet, but if you haven't, I suggest you go download it on your iPhone and give it a try. Excuse me. And I'll talk about some of why I think some of the casual elements we tried to build into this game. So I want to talk a little bit about what do I mean by casual games. So here's a bunch of older folks playing with the Wii, and this is sort of the wrap on casual games. That they're sort of aimed at old people, not really for gamers. But as we see with these guys here playing Wii tennis at an event called Wimbledon each year in Williamsburg, the Wii, and casual games allow for play for older people and play for younger people. It allows for super casual play, excuse me, as well as really super competitive play. It's sort of a matter of how how people get into the game and what kind of they want to get out of it. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about casual games is they operate along a spectrum of engagement, from the super light to the super deep. That is, if the game is deep enough to support it. You'll have to excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cough this week. So I want to talk principles of game design, of casual game design. These are things that I kind of, sort of my theories on what makes for a game casual based on, doing a bunch of research and really thinking deeply about like what are the common elements to casual games. So oftentimes in games, we're always trying to give people goals that kind of structure their behavior within a game. And in more complex games, we want to layer on lots of different goals. So have people doing one thing, and then trying to get them to do another. So you're trying to get a goal as well as some more ancillary goals. And oftentimes that's kind of confusing, especially for the casual player. I think one of the things you really have to think of with casual games is the rules and goals have to be clear. You can't give people, what you really want to do is boil it down to sort of one path they really should be proceeding along. And through some clever game design, I think you can begin to layer in other goals and stuff. But really, like, the main path through the game should be clear to the player. Um, Oftentimes in a lot of games, it takes a fair amount of mastery. We are approached with these very large systems with all these buttons to press. If you think of like especially something like the Xbox controller, it's got up it's around like 12 or 15 buttons on the thing, and that's a lot of buttons. If you think back to an NES controller, that only had about like 5 buttons, or an old joystick, there's just a joystick and 1 button. And as these controllers and all have gotten more complicated, obviously people have had a harder time being able to use them. But it's not just that; it's like they have gotten more complex. Games are constantly marching towards greater and greater complexity. And one of the things I think is very important for casual games is they have to be simple enough that people can reach proficiency very quickly. So here's the instructions for Pong. The classic instructions: ball will serve automatically, avoid missing ball for high score. It all boils down to that. And what's really important about that is it allows for a really quick, it allows players to develop a very quick proficiency at the game. It may take them a while to master the game, but they can get to the point where they can play well very quickly. And I think this is something you see over and over again in casual games. Everything from Bejeweled to Wii Tennis. The game allows you into it. It allows you to feel like you're doing well very quickly, so players don't feel like they have to spend hours controls work. Thinking about a game like I played Fallout 3 last year, and I'm relatively familiar with how shooters work and how RPGs work, and even then, I still took me about half an hour to figure out how the inventory system and how to change weapons in the game. And if you required a casual player to spend half an hour frustrated just figuring out the general controls, you would have lost them. Most casual players, you have to hook with your game within 30 seconds or so. You have to let them quickly get to a point where they're feeling success. So here's Mass Effect. I think it's a picture of Mass Effect 2. This is one of these games with long RPGs that takes multiple hours to complete. 15, 20 hours depending on if you do all the missions. And that's not unusual for an RPG. A lot of them take, you have games that take up to 70 hours. They're old Japanese role-playing games which took, over that. And so what those games did is they really took over your life. They were really very much about you sort of bending to the will of the game. The game, kind of became the central component. You had to sort of sit down at your console or sit down at your computer and play for a long period of time. And I think what you're seeing with casual games is a real change in that the game really has to now adapt to the player's life and schedule as opposed to you adapting to the game schedule. And so, here's this representative from Connecticut famously caught playing Bejeweled on his cell phone at some congression. What I think this shows is, there's lots of people, even congressmen are playing games. You just have to be able to slot them in time periods where they feel that when they want to play or when something really boring is going on. Or you're waiting at the doctor's office, people have less and less time to play, and so you have to give them ways to play in the times that sort of fit with them, rather than requiring a lot of the player. And so you see this in everything from Facebook games like Farmville, which allow you to play for a couple minutes a day, to iPhone games or handheld games, which allow for very quick bursts of play. And then the next thing I want to talk about is this idea of casual games really have this feeling of familiarity. So here's a picture of a classic diner, and when you look at this, you can see very quickly how the people who made visiting this diner could come up with a game like Diner Dash. And I know that some of them, when the designers made Diner Dash, they were actually they thought very much about how does a diner work. Really interesting idea. So with casual games, you get a lot of casual games that are borrowing very familiar content, things from everyday life. The players to kind of more quickly get into it. So you don't have to know how to be a space marine. You just kind of have to know how a diner works. And that's I think a really important thing. Diner Dash to Guitar Hero or Rock Band using this with a plastic guitar and Rock Band guides your play. You pick it up and you instantly know what to do with it. So I think one of the important things for game designers is to take this moment of play and transform it. So here's this little girl playing soccer, or kicking a ball around in her backyard. Okay, good, just checking. So she has this, she's kicking a ball around, and she's not really necessarily following any rules when she's doing it, but you can see how this moment here gets transformed into something like this, and the Steven Gerrard playing for Liverpool. And I think this is a really interesting, so there's this sort of playful activity in the game. Oftentimes the way I approach design is to look for those playful moments where someone's doing something. So this girl may be kicking around a ball, and at some point, enough rules form around what she's doing. She's like, okay, well, I don't pick it up with my hands. I only kick it with my feet. And my goal is really to get it past, my dad or my mom. And from there, you can begin to see how that evolves into the actual rules of a game like soccer. And so if you actually go and look at the rules of soccer, they're 155 pages long, according to FIFA, the official guidelines for soccer, which cover everything from how many people are on the pitch to what kind of socks you can wear. But none of those are as important as the sheer fact of this is a game that you kick the ball with your feet, and you're really trying to get it past someone. You're trying to get it past the goalie into the goal. And so as a game designer, looking for those elements of play and then using those as sort of the building blocks of your game is a really good way to approach design, in my opinion, especially casual design. And once you have that, you kind of can get this core idea of a game. So if you look at like a game like Super Mario Brothers, this is the core idea of Super Mario Brothers. It's all about jumping. Originally, even Donkey Kong was Jumpman. That's what he did. He just jumps. So he jumps on things. He jumps on mushrooms. He jumps on turtles. He jumps over plants. He runs and he jumps on pipes. And the entire based around this core idea, and it's the entire world of Super Mario Brothers and all the levels in it are sort of an extrapolation of this one core idea, and what you can do with it. So, eventually, notion of jumping goals, you say, okay, we have to rescue the princess. Well, how do you rescue the princess? You get to the end of the level. But again, it all comes back to this core idea of jumping. So once you have that core idea, as we were talking about before, it's all about giving it clear goals and saying, well, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to make a game out of this core idea? What are the built around it? And so then you sit down and write out the rules, or if you're making a video game, you maybe spec it out. I do think it's actually really important to think about actually writing down the rules of the game, even if you're making there's a really important, there's a really useful conceptual process to actually think out what the rules would be. To if you're making, even if you make a Bejeweled, you don't really think of Bejeweled as having rules. You think of it operating certain ways, but you could on the rules of Bejeweled and say things like, you can only swap gems if the gems swap into a map gems adjacent to other gems. And so from that, you begin to see what does this system really look like. Then you go and build that game, and through program it, make and move through various processes of building it. So you get something that you can play test, and you play test that game and find out what works and what doesn't, and inevitably it doesn't work the way you thought it would. So you go back and you do the whole thing again. You kind of go back to the beginning and say, well, what's my core idea? Is my core idea working? What do I need to refine on it? What do I need to refine, and what do I need to refine on the rules to really bring out the elements of fun in this? So I think it's really important to have a very broad appetite for games when you're thinking about designing them, and consume everything from casual games like Bejeweled to StarCraft to Windows Solitaire. All these games have really interesting components to them. You may find there's more similarities between Bejeweled and StarCraft than you realize. But it's also important to play games like Windows Solitaire, which is arguably the most popular video game in the world. And so why is that? Why do so many people play this game? It's not just because it's installed on everyone's PC, because it's a very from playing it with cards. And I think it's also important to not only play Windows Solitaire, but to actually play real Solitaire, because it's a very different experience. Here you have a game which is operating along the same rule set, but it has a very experience when you actually lay out the cards. So in Windows Solitaire, you have no problem reshuffling the deck after a couple of moves if it doesn't look like it's going right. But if you spend 5 minutes laying out Solitaire cards, you're going to spend a little more time trying to figure out the solution before you... So in this sense, games are very much about the context they're played in. And then it's important to look at real-world games. And this is I'm a big proponent of real-world games. As I said, we run Come Out and Play and Gigantic Mechanics, all are based very much around making real-world location-based games. I think there's a lot of value to be had in thinking about those games, especially from a game design point of view and a casual game design point of view. Because if you ask someone to run around outside and play a game, you have to make sure you keep the rules simple enough that people can remember all of the rules in their head. There's this idea that we have, the human brain is a very fast processor. It just doesn't have a lot of memory, right? So we have all these powerful computers in our heads, but we can't keep a lot of rules in our heads very easily. So you really have to think about, what do you want to boil your rules down to? How do you boil them down to a list that people can keep track of in their heads? So in this game, I think Journey to the Night is a wonderful example of that. So this is a game of zombie tag. Some of you are probably familiar with it. So say we were playing this game. 20 of us start out as runners, and one person starts out as it, and you get all these arms. They gave people, in traditional zombie tag, 20 people start out as runners, one person starts out as it. I'm it. I tag something. Now there's 2 of us chasing everyone else, and this keeps growing and growing until there's one person left at the end with 20 people chasing them, and it's a very frightening, sort of intense experience for people. And so what they did with zombie tag, with Journey to the Night, was they took the rules of zombie tag and spread them out across an entire city. They gave people armbands and maps of New York, and then sent them running across the city and playing the game. And this was extremely, people who played it, they said it was an extremely intense experience. The rules of zombie tag were simple and something they were familiar with, but the experience of doing it in New York City, totally changed the dynamics of the game. Excuse me. So this is a game called Hopscotch Highways. This is a game. Excuse me. Done last year at Come Out and Play. This is really simple. They essentially took the traditional hopscotch grid and made it bigger. So they allowed you to get down the ground and draw a very long, hopscotch grid that ran all the way through this large area of Times Square, and then the game was essentially a race to see who could get through these very long hopscotch highways fastest. And what was kind of most interesting about this game, it was really simple, was just how it took a very simple rule set that you understood and modified it. And then also, another game that really used the space of Times Square to great effect. The game in itself wasn't terribly interesting, but playing it in Times Square was very interesting. It just was it became a performative thing, relating to the people around you and who was watching you.